The situation in Afghanistan was really something we could predict for the last 3-4 years, and probably that a lot of prevention could have been taken into consideration. And it shows also clearly that civil societies, whether international or national, should lead those kind of process instead of military. I don't think that a military presence was really the solution in Afghanistan. I mean, a stronger initiative at the civil society level would have been much better.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to WorldView. At WorldView, we explore everyone's perspectives on all things that can broaden our worldview. And today it's my unique pleasure and honor to welcome Dr. Brigitte Piquard, who is the reader in Humanitarian Action and Conflict at Oxford Brookes University. She is also the director of the Center for Action Research and Resilience. Resilience is something we're gonna really dive into in this discussion. But let me just introduce Brigitte a little bit more. For the last 25 years, Brigitte has been conducting and developing university higher education programs focusing on humanitarian action across Europe. She has carried out most of her research in South and Southeast Asia, in the Balkans, South Caucasus, and the Middle East, focusing on conflict and humanitarian issues such as culture of peace and war, transitional political setups, and social rehabilitation of war-torn societies. She has worked on themes such as space and violence, and she's also the author of books and various articles related to cities in crisis and architecture and conflict, and the separation wall in the West Bank. She is currently working on capacity building initiatives and action research projects with national NGOs in Colombia, Lebanon, and the Central African Republic. Brigitte, thank you so much for joining us at WorldView today.
Thank you, Jon-Hans, for inviting me. It's really a pleasure for me to be there as well.
Pleasure is absolutely ours. Thank you so much for your time. So, Brigitte, if we can dive straight into the discussion, we would like to frame the discussion around the humanitarian development peace nexus and to really have a critical discussion with you. But before we do so, who is the fascinating individual behind these big titles that I just mentioned? Who is the woman called Brigitte? Tell us a little bit more about yourself, and how did you embrace a career focusing on being an academic, but also being very much community-based and working in partnership with communities, focusing on humanitarianism?
Well, actually, I started as an activist. Even when I was a late teenager, I was already quite an activist in Amnesty International and some different organizations. And I have been extremely privileged when I was a bit less than 20 years old, so quite young, to go to Pakistan to work in the Afghan refugee sites. It was obviously a very life experience and life-changing experience when you are almost a teenager, let's say more a very young adult, and that you have to start being exposed to this kind of situation. So I started really working on different issues because I wanted to bring a change. And I moved quite quickly from activism to academia. I mean, it's not maybe totally true to say that because I don't think I have ever left the activist side. But I searched for a way of making a change was slightly different. And I felt that through capacity strengthening, I could really make something. I realized very quickly that there is a lot of knowledge already existing in capacities in all the places where I was working, and that the role we should play was much more a role of capacity facilitators, cultural translators, than strictly speaking, someone who go and develop project.
Thank you for that, Brigitte. Um, so if we could ask you also to unpack for our audience, how would you define and what are the tenets of the humanitarian development peace nexus? What are the tenets? And can I then, the second part of the question, ask you to give us your opinion of where we are with that nexus as we reach the second cusp of the 21st century?
I would say I think that humanitarian action is really going into a huge paradigm shift for the moment. Uh, the nexus you are talking about, the localization, the type of crisis we have to deal with, is really forcing the sector to think about a change. I mean, almost forced to change. The nexus, the peace, development, humanitarian nexus, has been really brought in, let's say, 10 years ago. And for the last 10 years, we realized that we have to go beyond linking humanitarian action and development, which was already quite a shift in terms of thinking, and to add the peace dimension into it. Knowing, of course, that humanitarian action and peace building can sometimes be a bit opposed. I mean, it's very difficult to respect all the principle of both without sometimes being a bit in a very difficult, let's say, intersection. But further to that, and I'm sure we will discuss it right now, there is so many new issues that we have to bring into this nexus. Climate change is one, obviously, and when we see all the floods, for example, that we have known in Europe this summer, we know, of course, that we have to get ready to something else. Let's think about the pandemic, which has been changing our life for the last 2 years now. This is something new, and this is also a humanitarian issue. And it's new because it's not only touching certain zone in crisis, it touches all of us. And we are all affected, and we will be all affected, not only by pandemic, but by climate change, by turbulence that are also happening in all our societies. So indeed, we really have to rethink differently geographically, but in terms of scope, in terms of content, how we will deal with humanitarian action. And then, as you say, there is also the issue of who are humanitarian actors today.
Um, Really interesting, Brigitte, that you say the paradigm needs to fundamentally shift. And within that framework, can I please ask you how then do we, in trying to update this nexus, how do we then work and identify and the difference between risks and threats when we focus on resilience and humanitarianism?
Yes, resilience. I mean, you are bringing resilience, which is maybe the core concept that we can develop in all what we have been talking about, whether it's relief, development, peace building, climate change, pandemic. I think enhancing resilience of communities, of people, of organization is probably one of the main shifts. Uh, well, when we talk about this um, risk equation, it's clear that reducing vulnerabilities and reducing threats is probably the only way of reducing risk. And therefore, this is really what we have to try to see. What are the threats today? How can we try to mitigate them or to reduce them? And the same for vulnerabilities, because it's clear that the risks are mostly for the most vulnerable. But again, when we talk about climate change and when we talk about pandemics, we are all vulnerables. And therefore, we have to see how can we deal with all the different vulnerabilities and the new vulnerabilities which are existing today.
And Brigitte, can you please give us some examples of how you have worked in reducing this element of communal and individual vulnerabilities in any one of the projects in which you work, just to help the worldview audience to understand from a more practical perspective some of the results that you've achieved and how you've gone about it?
Well, as I said, I work a lot on capacity enhancement. But the capacity enhancement can take very different form. It can take the form of formal education in a higher education institution, like in universities, but it can also take very practical grassroots initiatives. And those grassroots initiatives are mostly about trust. How do we recreate trust and confidence? How do we create trust for a local actor who usually have a very hard time to navigate in the humanitarian sector, who do not know the technology, who do not know always the jargon that the humanitarian actors are using? How do we make them feel that the impressive knowledge that they have of the context or of the communities can be really valued, and that they can be considered as credible and trusted partners, for example, for humanitarian organization. And that goes really with the fact of really creating a locus of control, in the sense that we wish local organization to have a sense that they can influence their own future, which in protracted crisis, because most of the crises we have today are protracted, is quite complicated for local actors to really understand that what he will do with hardly no resources, definitely financial resource, but sometimes very limited human resources, he can still influence very positively the future of his own communities. And practically that goes by doing a lot of self-evaluation, for example, and trying to work on strengths and not on deficit. A lot of program has always been trying to reduce deficit. If you start looking at the program differently by really celebrating the strengths and trying to reinforce the existing strengths, you are really working on the locus of control.
Allow me to loop back to something that really resonated when you were saying it's all about capacity enhancement, grassroots initiatives, and to build trust. How do you then, when you talk about protracted conflicts, and as you said, the majority of conflicts today are intra border protracted conflicts, how then does the mandates that different humanitarian organizations obtain to operate in certain conflict areas, how does that work when you talk about non-international protracted conflicts versus international conflicts? Because if I'm not wrong, the majority of these conflicts are within national borders, and therefore it is the government that is in charge, will decide which humanitarian actors can enter and operate or not. So how does that work? Talk us a little bit through that legal mechanisms.
Well, I'm not a lawyer, I'm an anthropologist, so forgive me if I may not be able really to talk purely on legalistic term. As you say, there is so different cases. There is cases where you have a government which is in charge, and clearly this is the government to decide who can work in the country. There are cases where there is a government, but the government is not legitimate for the population, and therefore it creates really bridge in terms of international humanitarian law, because who decide in the case who is legitimate or not? Is it the population? Is it the government? Is it the international communities? Then you have cases where there is no government, or almost no government, when it's completely failed state. We cannot really consider that the kind of authorities which is there can represent the population. So who in that case will decide? And well, organization works very much on this principle of humanity. I mean, the fact that there is a humanitarian imperative. If there is huge imperative humanitarian needs, there is therefore a humanitarian space and a need to intervene in a way or another. It's usually extremely complicated. It goes with really respect of very strict humanitarian principle, neutrality, impartiality, independence. But in the same time, it works also a lot with the support of the local actors when there is. I'm here talking more about the civil society than the government. And the issue is that how do we keep principles like neutrality, impartiality, independence when we start working through or with local actors? And this is where we realize that international humanitarian law and even humanitarian principle have limits when we work in protracted conflict.
That's really interesting, Brigitte, what you just mentioned, because this basis of humanitarian priority, humanitarian necessities, and the sort of guiding principles of the humanitarian principles all loop back to the element what you mentioned before of trust of you as a humanitarian actor, service provider, is able to be accepted by all parties to a conflict, and to be able to, I would assume, it's first to have the assurance of your humanitarian action, the access, and also to the victims, but also to have the warring parties to ensure your safety and protection, that you would not become a victim of the conflict. Based on that, how important, because you several times mentioned the local communities, working with the community structures, how important in your experience is the traditional knowledge within communities to find these solutions? Or is it only the only sacrosanct model is that of the state, the elected leaders in place, and what is known as the Westphalian notion of state? Because in so many patriarchal societies, such as you have in Africa and in Asia, as we've seen in Afghanistan, where you have also a very, very strong influence of indigenous knowledge and indigenous code of conduct. How do you manage between those two?
I would say that local knowledge is probably one of the missing link in humanitarian action today. Many organizations, international organizations, start programs with the idea that there is hardly no local knowledge existing, and they bring or a system wisdom, a system that does not always fit the culture and the knowledge, the existing knowledge, but also maybe even not always the understanding of what humanitarian action is. This is probably one of the main challenge of this localization agenda today, is how can we bring knowledge in it. You talk about indigenous knowledge. The indigenous knowledge is usually quite recognized, but usually limited to technical know-how. For example, how do we rebuild shelters with traditional means? How do we cultivate traditionally? This is quite regularly and more often integrated in humanitarian action. But what I'm talking more about is really the humanitarian action as such. Usually for local actors, humanitarian action is first of all a social interaction, much more than a service delivery. The process is as important as the product. So the way things are done is as important as what is delivered. So who are the person who will be consulted? How is access negotiated? Has traditional leaders been consulted? Will food, for example, being delivered to leaders before being delivered to the rest of the communities? Where will the food distribution take place? Will people, if there is a religious power, being able to bring a religious dimension to the food distribution? All of this is as important as the quality of the food that will be delivered. And with sometimes those principles of neutrality and impartiality, you reduce a lot the social dimension. You create a kind of social distancing, because you do not want to breach neutrality or impartiality. You do not intermix a lot with the communities. And the local actors will do exactly the opposite. They will first consider the humanitarian project as a social interaction, and then the service will come after. So there is really a full humanitarian knowledge existing within those communities, and this is really the challenge: is to accept the idea that you can have a functional and an operational knowledge in order to do humanitarian action, which works, and which works pretty well, and which can protect a lot, because they will work also through traditional informal protection mechanism. They will work with in the entire communities. They know the historicity of the groups, so they know people within almost each group, and they can negotiate access much easier. So there is quite a lot of things that we can really gain by trying to identify first value in second, and then to transfer all this existing humanitarian knowledge.
Brigitte, you are referring to very specific and highly specialized skill sets in that humanitarian space. Can you share with us a little bit some of these educational programs that you've developed for universities? Talk us a little bit through some of those specific skill sets that individuals can then study in order to better perform, to enhance their individual skills, to more effectively operate in this humanitarian space?
Well, we have created a few different master degree, and one with the United Nations Institute of Training and Research, which is a fully online master in humanitarian action and peace building, which is actually investigating all those issues. How do we find positive intersection between development, peace building, and humanitarian action? In this sector, I would say, of course, there is all the technical know-how that we have to know, but more importantly, I think this is really the soft skill, which is very important. And the two which we really stress on are really the critical thinking, which is something really that we need to develop much further in this field, and also the self-reflexivity. How do humanitarian actors think about the decision they have taken? How can they constantly learn lesson about what they are doing in order not to reinvent the wheel all the time. And because there is still a lot of work that needs to be done, the field is actually quite new in a way. I mean, modern humanitarian action date from the end of the Second World War. You will say it's already quite a long time ago, but in the development of an academic field, this is nothing. This is really a very new field. Development is much older. It's maybe 50 years older. And so we still have to create a lot or to, let's say, more than create, to systematize a lot of the knowledge we have. But I think that if people have the right soft skill, if we really teach them how to be critical, how to reflect on what they do, how to learn to really to draw lesson from what is happening in the field, how we can take into consideration the context, the culture, I think we can really improve humanitarian action.
Um, Brigitte, allow me to briefly also for us to reflect on a little bit more of the darker side of humanitarianism, because you mentioned specific skill sets, namely critical thinking, self reflexivity, but when one goes into so many of these areas of conflict, and when you witness firsthand, man's cruelty and barbarity towards his fellow man, how do you, as a humanitarian worker, how do you digest that? How do you, because we also know that post-traumatic stress disorder and suicide is quite high amongst humanitarian actors. So how and what is being done in order to create a social safety net for individuals that are constantly witnessing firsthand the barbarity of man?
Well, of course, well-being and self-protection is a very crucial element in our sector as well, which again is probably quite new. I would say that it's really after the Balkan War, then humanitarian workers have been really thinking we have to take care of ourselves, or we cannot take care of others if we cannot first take care of ourselves. This is really the helping the helpers approach. And it comes from that period, because I think this is through the Balkan War that humanitarian workers has really started identifying themselves with the victims. Because it was another European societies, and it was people like them who were reading the same book, listening to the same music, and watching maybe the same movies on TV. So people, they could just identify and think that, well, what happened to them could have happened to to the humanitarian workers. So from that moment, there have been really a lot of PTSDs, post disaster, post trauma. And then there have been also a wave of suicide that was either hidden before or not really acknowledged, because the suicide comes usually more 6 months, 8 months after the return than right after the return. So usually when people are not working with the organization anymore. And yes, so there are mechanisms more and more put in place in order to make sure that people will have access to counselor, that it's a right to be distressed when you are in a field of operation. There are also very good team work, team well-being elements that we can put in place. And obviously when people are very highly traumatized, they have to have access to psychologist, or to at least professional counselor. It cannot be done just by a team member. But you talk about the atrocity, but we can also, and this is not being over optimistic, there is also a lot of resilience and amazing initiative happening in field, in humanitarian field. I personally have felt sometimes much more empowered than disempowered when I came back. not of course due to the atrocities, but mainly because the type of resilience that you see from the population, but also sometimes the strength in believing in peace, believing in the future of their own societies, the way they help each other is sometimes something that you say, okay, I still have really to learn a lot. I would be so much more disempowered than them in front of what they have to face. And usually when you come back, you may feel very disempowered, but you can be also extremely strong by saying, I wish that I have half the strength of those people. That will be so amazing.
Brigitte, again, on behalf of WorldView, I also want us to acknowledge that you are a woman in this field, and really in so many of your research where you are really pushing the action research to integrate so much more of all these different elements that deals with resilience, but resilience based on and in partnership with local communities. So I also, on behalf of WorldView, want us to use this opportunity and to mark your contribution as a woman in this area. So thank you very much for that as well, Brigitte.
Thank you, Jon-Hans. I think that there are more and more women than we believe in this field. I would say 20 years ago, probably, I was usually the only one. And I remember working in Afghanistan or other countries and being just the only, at least visible woman who could be there and sit with men and discuss. And it's much less true today. I think that when you go in field, you will be surprised to see how many young women are even chief of operation for international organization. So I think this is also a shift that is really happening right now.
Thank you for sharing that with us, Brigitte. Can I ask you also to share with us a little bit how you assess the situation in Afghanistan right now, and if you were to project 3 to 5 years from now, the evolution of the humanitarian challenges on the one side, and the other side, what do you think are the structure and systems that need to be put in place, and which organizations should lead those operations to ensure that the Afghan population is not forgotten? Because you can already see where when we saw this mass exodus of the Western forces, non-stop, it was on our television. Today, you hardly have anything about Afghanistan. You may have something about the Taliban, but about the Afghan population, it's as if the news has shifted. How do you see those balance and in terms of service and actions that need to be delivered, and which are those organizations that should lead those activities?
Yeah, there will be three dimensions in my answer. First, again, the lack of lesson learned is probably the first thing that will come to my mind, though I'm not fully answering your question. But the situation in Afghanistan was really something we could predict for the last 3-4 years, and probably that a lot of prevention could have been taken into consideration. And it shows also clearly that civil societies, rather international or national, should lead those kind of process instead of military. I don't think that a military presence was really the solution in Afghanistan. I mean, stronger a stronger initiative at the civil society level would have been much better. That's for the past. For the future and for the present, the difficulties in all those actions is to find the right moment to intervene. Obviously, there is a lot that can be done right now for supporting the Afghan refugees or exiled people, the past one and the one that just left right now. And there is a lot of advocacy work that can be done now for not forgetting Afghanistan. We know how many what we call forgotten crises exist in the world. And there is absolutely an imperative to make sure that Afghanistan will not be forgotten. That's a certainty. Of course, it does not really help the population, except that at least we do not shut our eyes on what is really happening. Then I think that who should do that? This is extremely difficult with a regime like the Taliban. Probably the one who are still talking to them should be the first who should be able to do something. I'm thinking of Qatar, for example, or other countries. And again, putting again a bit the light on the fact that Afghans are not just passive and just poor victims of the Taliban. There is already so many local communities doing things. We see very regularly women demonstration, but we do not see as often the kind of hidden school who are reopening for women a bit all over Afghanistan today, or happen on roof of houses or in a backyard, just for maybe 10, 15 little girls who can continue their education. People really risk their life for doing this, for just opening a school and educated 15 young girls. And this is really still happening today in Afghanistan. So we should not think that Afghans are just passive victims. They are very, very proactive people. And as much as we will be able to monitor this and find the window of opportunities for supporting as far as we can, I think there is still hope. The Afghan has proved towards the last decades how strong and amazing people they were, and I'm sure that they will continue to be. But indeed, there could not be a massive intervention today, right now. I mean, on October 2021, we cannot say, okay, this organization should intervene in Afghanistan right now. I think it's a bit too early.
Brigitte, can I ask you, and again, it's a very personal question, and if you want to skip, I'll respect it, but can you please share with us one of your humanitarian interventions that you would deem amongst your most successful, but equally an intervention that, in your eyes, were a total failure, and why?
One that I've been involved in, you mean?
Exactly.
Yeah. I don't know if I have many highly positive or highly negative. I think we are very often in a very gray zone, and where there is positive and negative impact. And the idea is obviously to try to have more positive than negative impact. I think most of the work that I'm the most proud of, that does not mean that they were the most impactful, are those where I have seen afterwards the communities feeling stronger for taking initiative. That could have, there were rural schools, for example, in Colombia, where I felt that Federation of School have been able to take more initiative. In Palestine, I was extremely proud in Hebron to see people really reorganizing themselves in order to be, to strengthen what they call the sumud, which is the steadfastness. But this is every time small changes. I do believe in small change. I don't believe in massive changes. And I think in different program in Central African Republic, we have seen also organizations who were much more resilient after after the kind of mentorship that we have given them. But every time it was just tiny changes. It's not this kind of impressive change. I think that this is what we have maybe to aim for. It's small change will start snowballing much more than trying to change entirely societies. And the one who were the less successful were probably the one-shot type of approach or the plug-and-play approach. I've been sometimes giving training would have been the same everywhere in the world, and then you give the training and you leave, and you do not make any form of mentorship afterwards in order to support the learners to implement the new learning. Um, this is usually this kind of or distribution type of project where there is no real follow-up. I think that we have to give ourselves time, which is something that humanitarian actors have never allowed them before. Time for mentoring, for following up, for monitoring what is happening before and after, and allowing that program can go slow. You cannot have extraordinary change overnight. And when you see Afghanistan today, if someone wants to shift, to change entirely the situation overnight, we can predict that it will be a failure before starting. If we agree that we will go with very small changes with those who are ready to try to make those change, we can maybe start a process and really count on this snowballing impact afterwards.
Brigitte, you just the elegance of who you are was just clearly demonstrated, because my question was very much focusing on Brigitte Piquard. How would she measure success and failure? And you very eloquently twisted and said, no, it's about the community, and it's about those small, tiny, but solid steps of a community. So you just reminded me again that it's about that capacity enhancement, the grassroots initiatives, and building that trust to reduce risks and threats. And the primary concern is the local communities. Allow me then to ask you the second question, because you spoke a little bit about the short-sightedness of some of these institutions and organizations that then populate this humanitarian space. Can you share with us the modalities and experience that you've had with the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, and then in contrast, or in another model, is the United Nations system? Can you share with us how you've worked with both these institutional approaches in that humanitarian space to deliver?
Well, I never really worked with the International Committee of the Red Cross. Of course, I know them. I have been in different meetings with them, but in the field, I really never worked much with them. I have sometimes a problem with the neutrality because, again, working mostly with local actors by definition, we are not always neutral. As long as we are impartial and then we are respecting all the population in need, I think we are doing already a clear job. The UN are definitely a fundamental actors in the field because of the presence a bit all over, and also because of the resources that they have financially and in terms of human resources. And but I think that the UN has to go into maybe a paradigm shift as well, and building more and more on local actors as well, and reducing their role really as a coordination role, which they do sometimes more and more, and trying to find a way of introducing this kind of local knowledge and local perspective. which still need to be done a bit, because they still have a tendency of seeing very often local actors as implementers, much more than decision makers. So I think the main challenge for them would be to be able to include local NGOs, for example, in a core leadership role in the cluster level. So that would be probably one of the most successful impact of the localization agenda. So it's coming, it's moving. When we are in the field, when we discuss with field workers, we just realize that many think the same things and are ready to go into the same direction. But of course, this is, again, we need time, and we have to give ourselves time for that.
Allow us, Brigitte, for the second part of our discussion, if we can dive a little bit into the one theme that you mentioned during your opening statement, and that is the reality of climate change. And how do you see climate change as a risk multiplier effect in conflict affected and fragile contexts? How do we the humanitarian action and skill sets that looks at relief, but also the development specificity? How do you ensure that continuity from relief to development? Because I'm a bit of a skeptic when I say I understand the sense of relief, but when in protracted conflict zones, but I have difficulty to understand the notion of development in protracted and high risk environment. And now that there is another layer, which we see almost on a daily basis, the effects of climate change, which is here and now. It's not something that we even last year we spoke about climate change if we don't do something in the next 5 to 10 years, and here we are, and we see the effects taking place as we speak.
Yeah, it's clear that we have so many new challenges that we have to start thinking of. And they are interacting. I mean, we cannot think that climate change is an entirely different field than conflict or peace building. I will give you 2 examples coming from Colombia, or 3 maybe. First, I realized personally the link between climate change and conflict a few years ago, when some internally displaced people in Colombia were telling me that they were not able to go back. They had dreamed all their life to go back to their home, their original home, and they were not able to go because it was impossible to graze cattle anymore, because there was not enough water, and the temperature has increased so much over the time they were displaced, so that it was all the dream of their life, but also the prospect for peace, who were going away. Because if the population cannot go back home, then how can you start really restabilizing a situation? Second, things in Colombia as well is that we have seen the migration of the drug production because of climate change. Drugs is cultivated in a certain height, and so it moved from certain place to others, and it was actually the same height than the coffee growing areas, and so all the coffee growers were displaced due to climate change, actually. And the third was the fact that indigenous communities usually have live in places where there is a lot of water resources. And we have seen a lot of assassination of indigenous leaders just because people want to control water and water resources. And this is really impact of climate change in conflict, of conflict on climate change. So the two are definitely linked. So that's one part of your answer, is that we have really now to think everything globally. We should stop really creating sector like relief in one side, development on another side, climate change on the third one, peace building as a fourth one. We have really to think and to act much more comprehensively. So that's part of your answer. The second one answer is to say, you were wondering how can we really think development in a protracted conflict. Well, actually, conflict does not affect all areas or all sectors at the same time in the same way. So there could be pocket of violence, but there is also pocket of non-violence in a conflict zone. So development can be already taking place even within the conflict. We can really start long-term development. And we should not forget that conflict area or crisis area are usually areas of creativity, because in order to be able to cope with the situation, you need really to rethink differently, to to create. I mean, we can just see what has happened over the last 20 months with the pandemic, to see all the innovation that take place in the way of working, the way of reorganizing life, using, of course, media and distance and online media in order to recreate new form of life. So all crises are period of creativity, and within this creativity we can do quite a lot in terms of development.
Um, you make me think of Winston Churchill, who during the when London was under attack by the Nazis, he said, and I quote, "Every crisis also presents opportunities that should not be wasted." And I think you stated that very well when you use this global health crisis that we are all trying to navigate through, how we have also seen some really innovative and creative solutions, and to for us to continue to exchange views. And a very good example is indeed WorldView. Here we are having a very rich, in-depth discussion about something that is of fundamental importance, and that is how do we deliver effective humanitarian action in this highly complex environments that we have, and also the onslaught of climate change. Can I ask you also, Brigitte, because you touched on natural resources, which of course each and every community should have free access to natural resources. But we've also seen big commercial companies that are purchasing the right to exploit. And I'm talking about a big company based in Switzerland, who basically owns the world's fresh water supplies. So how do you engage and start a conversation where a price tag is put on natural resources?
That's probably another form of peace negotiation that we have to start thinking of, is working with economic actors, especially international economic actors. There should be also a code of conduct and ethics, not only in international humanitarian law, but also in international trade law, in working in conflict zone, or at least in crisis zone, or places which can be considered as fragile and vulnerable. It's clear that the control on natural resources is definitely one of the main cause of conflict, but it can be also one of the main cause of failure of peace negotiation. Water is definitely one of the main big stake in all what we are doing. And this is not really the work of humanitarian actors, but definitely of peace negotiators, of state organization. It will be to know how we can try to control or negotiate or reduce the right that people can have on global resources. Energy is obviously another one, but I think that the main risk element is water, even much more than energy today.
Thank you so much for that, Brigitte. I have two final questions for you, and the second last one is, if you were to give advice to future humanitarian workers, humanitarian professionals, or anybody that has an interest to explore the humanitarian space, what would be the advice that you would give them? What would be the best way to go about dipping their fingers into this fascinating space called humanitarian action and humanitarianism?
I would tell them first, I mean, obviously develop your technical skill, but don't limit yourself to technical things. Learn about context. Really, this is something I think missing in a lot of humanitarian action, is really a deep knowledge of the context. So learn about the context, try keep in mind all the social aspect of what you are doing, and take never take things for granted. uh, be able to put things into question quite a lot, reflect a lot on what you are doing, and question a lot what people are doing. So again, being critical, being reflective, don't take things for granted, and keep in mind that contexts are extremely important and usually undervalued in humanitarian action.
Thank you for those powerful words, Brigitte. Finally, if you were to be given the opportunity to send a message to somebody that you would consider to be a highly influential individual, who would that be, and what would you say to them? What is the message you would like to share with that one person that you think has such an influence about this space and the subject that we're talking about? Who would it be, and what would you say to them?
I honestly don't know who it would be. I mean, there is not a name that come in my mind directly. I mean, I'm usually much more impressed by less influential, but people in the field who make difference in the everyday life much more than those big names that we see on TV or that we can read about. Of course, I mean, international leaders can really make a huge difference. Um, Maybe the what I would tell them is the same that I would say to a young humanitarian worker, is reflect on what you do and think twice before taking a decision, and learn better where you are stepping in. Because if we look at most of the international intervention of the last decades, I mean, I'm thinking of Iraq, I'm thinking of Afghanistan or others. I mean, what was really missing is that a sound knowledge of the situation. So maybe give a bit more presence to people who knows the context, and choose the right person who knows the context in order to tell what is happening. I mean, yes, if we look at the last huge intervention, this is something that was absolutely obvious, is that people have started working without knowing where they were stepping in. So that's probably what I would ask them to think a bit more in the future.
And your personal message to the WorldView audience. Remember, we say at WorldView, we explore everyone's perspective on all things that can help us to broaden our worldview. Based on our discussion today, what would be those perspectives that you would like the WorldView audience to take away from our conversation?
that we are more powerful than we believe in terms of making change or bringing change in the communities where we are living or which are close from us, because indeed humanitarian action in the future will not always happen in far, far countries, but can happen on our doorstep, and therefore that we should probably try to think what can be the networks that we could engage in order to make sure that we can be resilient and self-reliant in the future. I think that there is really a lot that we can do in order to bring change. We can feel very overwhelmed by all what we are talking about. We have talked about conflict, pandemic, disaster. We have talked about climate change. If you look at it like that, you can feel completely overwhelmed to say, okay, we are in a lost world and nothing can change, and this is not me as a person who can really bring a change. But the reality is absolutely different, is that with the strength of the communities, with the strength of network, with all our innovation and creativity that we have, I think we can bring small changes. And as we said before, these are really the starting point and the most important things. If we start with small changing, there will be snowballing, and in the end, we may find ourselves with really impressive impact on the environment in which we are living.
Dr. Piquard, on behalf of Donald Brown, the co-founder of WorldView and the WorldView community, thank you so much for taking the time to exchange your views with us on the humanitarian development nexus. And thank you also for so much of those less complicated but very sincere reminders that you gave us, that it wasn't about the individual, but it's about those partnerships of trust that you create with communities. And to the WorldView community, wherever you are, thank you also for connecting with us today and listening to the words of wisdom from Dr. Brigitte Piquard. Thank you very much.
Thank you to you, and thank you to WorldView for inviting me.